covering the tragedy, Dave Super, Rapid City Guide, Bill Duhamel and Monte Loos from KOTA Radio and TV. We have Jack Getz from the Rapid City Journal, and Ned Leonard, Rapid City Journal, Rapid Cable TV, and Kim Radio. So we want to start right away with the night of how we got the word out, and we're going to have to start with the broadcast journalists.
Okay.
And
Oh, that's right. I forget.
And hold it close.
Yeah. My daughter is giving me lectures about how to hold a microphone. So, okay, the first thing that we would start with is the concept of what a flood was 50 years ago. People did not anticipate what happened. To me, a flood was high water. You waded out of it. Nobody expected 65-mile-an-hour current coming down full of debris, parts of houses, electric lines down in the water, and it's just entirely different. One of the first things that I learned is I assumed a car gets in water, when it gets too deep, it sinks. I didn't know cars would float. And my wife and I crossed the Main Street Bridge on by the McDonald's, and there's water running over the bridge. And my wife says, "It's safe." I said, "Of course. We're in a car." Well, that was 50 years ago. The Monty and I are from KOTA, and we're only of two of the four people that were working at KOTA back then, so that are still alive. The hero of the event is really Rob DeWall, who was working the KOTA News the night of the flood, and he ended up in the basement of the courthouse broadcasting from the Flood Command Center and throughout the night. And I remember when I turned it on, I said, "Oh, he's exaggerating. He's talking about there could be 100 or dead." And I said, "Oh, come on, Rob. I mean, there'll be a few, but early in the morning when I was listening to him, I had no idea what had happened. He was the only broadcast communications to the public as to what was happening. Unfortunately, Rob died in January 2006, and I knew that he always kept detailed notes. Monty was the executive of estate, and I asked Monty, I said, "Did you ever see anything from the flood?" And he said, "Oh, there's a box of material there," and I gave it to Greta Chapman at the Rapid City Library for safekeeping, and she gave it to the Monte Loos Society for their collection here at the Journey, and so that's where that went. There's some people were critical of KOTA afterwards because they said we weren't issuing flood warnings and evacuation notices. And that's one of the things I wanted to concentrate here. Rob was a very detailed person. He was on the air that night, and then the rest of the summer was just, we called it the summer that wasn't. I mean, I was getting 4 hours sleep, and my wife would come down and man the phones while I was sleeping, and that's the way. And then I wasn't alone. That's the way everybody worked at the Rapid City Journal and at the broadcasters. That's just the way it was. In a recorded interview that Rob DeWall did with Mayor Don Burnett the evening of the flood, basically the mayor was tied up until 8 o'clock, and then he was at the Y swimming with his wife and 2 daughters, and when he left, or he's leaving, the clerk there said that they'd heard the flood warnings and possible flooding on the Rapid Creek and a lot of rain forecast. And Don said, "Where'd you hear that?" He said, "On the radio." Well, that was from the National Weather Service. They were putting out the warnings about heavy rain in the Black Hills and possible flooding, and that's the first. And Don said that, that's the first time he'd heard the word flooding. Now, the real question is what happened on the 2 hours in between, and essentially, KOTA radio received no notification from any official source. We were getting calls from people in the hills telling us, they're seeing water where there's never been water before. These are old timers up there. And they said, why aren't we saying more? And we would mention that we were getting that kind of information, but we couldn't go beyond that because we didn't want to start a panic. We didn't have information coming into us. And that was the plot. The Ron Messer, Chief Messer of the police department, did call us up and tell us that west of town there's a lot of rain up the Dark Canyon, and that if you tried to go there, don't travel west, and if you did, you'd probably get turned around. And the mayor told Ron to call with that message. Let's see, I'm just trying to skip through this because we've already gone through this pretty detailed before. Rob did say that either there is a complete lack of civil defense planning or a breakdown in communications between the local authorities and the broadcast news media in this 8 to 10 o'clock time period. And there's different stories of what happened when, outside, some people think the dam broke early, other people, and the dam really was an incident. Listening to afterwards, they said Canyon Lake, when it was built in the 30s, held about 600 acre-feet of water. By the time of the flood, it had silted in, and there was about 250 acre-feet of water in there. And they said thousands, plural, thousands of acre-feet of water came down that canyon that night. And the Canyon Lake, they might have slowed it down for a minute, but it was not the cause. The network news, that was the big deal. They remembered the Johnstown flood of 100 years ago, and they were trying to say this is like the Johnstown flood. It wasn't. Mayor Burnett did confirm there were no interviews, no official warnings issued by the city until after 10 o'clock. And he said he hadn't received any reports of problems upstreams. And he did mention that he talked to Holy Dean's son, Bart, yeah. And he had said the water was dropping around 9 o'clock. Well, then later on, Bart tried to call him and couldn't get through. And that's part of, those are the kind of problems that there's other terms for it. But the mayor's two-way radio was not connected to the media. So to call us, he had to walk to the Canyon Lake liquor store and use the phone to make a landline call. And that's when we got the evacuation notice after 10 o'clock. Let's see. Probably a lot of incidents. There's a lot of little incidental things there, but we have a recording of Rob saying KOTA radio, which normally signed off at midnight, will stay on as long as necessary. And even then, when he said that, he had no idea. This was around after 10 o'clock, the magnitude of what had happened. But about that time, the power failed at our studios down on St. Joe and 6th Street, and we were off the air. And the TV transmitter and the radio transmitter both went off, and then we have auxiliary power at the radio, but we couldn't get information out to them. So I saw Black Hills Power report where they said that around a little after the peak was right after 11 o'clock when 93% of the city's power load was gone. And within 51 minutes, they'd restored about 50%. And the reason it was gone was because the debris and the houses floating down were taking out power poles, phone poles, and they had to they called it resectionalizing, but basically they started feeding the sub-power plants from different directions. Because and I have a map here, showing where the water was that night. And unless you were in the flood, there's no reason you should have power except for the poles were down, and then they had to be reorganized. And then it took them to Saturday night before they got 90% of the power back. So, Monty, now you have the rest of the story.
The question was how to get information out to the public. That was vital that we got this out. And so Bob Laskowski and a radio engineer by the name of Art Exey went out to the KOTA radio transmitter site, which had that diesel generator in the small radio studio. And as Bill said, we couldn't get the information, so that didn't work as well as we had hoped. But around 3 a.m., we were able to establish a communication links between the Civil Defense Office at the courthouse and KOTA radio. At 3:30, Rob was now able to broadcast emergency messages and interviews from the courthouse via two-way radio. He remained on the air all night broadcasting this information, and at approximately 9:15 Saturday morning, Vern Shepard did arrive at the downtown radio studio and relieved Rob and continued on with the necessary messaging. At about 10 a.m., Black Hills Power was able to restore power up on Skyline Drive at the KOTA TV transmitter site, and we commenced telecasting at 12 noon on Saturday with regular programming and interrupted with emergency messages as necessary. And during this time on Saturday, there was the rumor about the Pactola Dam, and that it had cracks and may give way and more water come down. And I can remember when we broadcast a message from Sheriff Glenn Best stating that he was at Pactola and the dam was secure and there was no need for that to worry about.
Incidentally, that rumor was really Deerfield Dam. That's where the rumor was, and somehow it got transferred to Pactola.
One of the things that there was so many calls coming in. I lost my house. What's going to happen with my mortgage and those type of questions? Where do I get water and all those? So Saturday afternoon we had a meeting with local authorities to discuss what we could do to help the public, and we decided to do a 3-hour telecast on Sunday evening from 7 to 10 and let people, and it had the officials from local, state, and national officials here appearing on this panel. And people could call in and ask these questions, and they would respond from the proper authorities. And that had so many questions coming in after the 10 o'clock news, we continued on for another 30 minutes just to try and get as many of those questions as possible answered. One of the problems that we had was a lot of people coming up at KOTA with stories. We were stretched real thin with people trying to cover this flood as needed. And also the 3 major television networks appeared. And at KOTA we had the only equipment where we could send the stories back to New York. And so that had to happen with the time difference. It goes on the air in New York 2 hours before, in other words, at 4:30, we had to have that feeding all done back to New York, and we did that for the next 9 days. And so we were very, very busy. Talking about why we didn't have a lot of footage of film that was shot that night, we did have. Yeah, Stu Steele, and we didn't have the water to do the developing of the film. It was 16 millimeter film, and when we ran it through our processor, after it came out of development, it needed to get rinsed before it went into the fix and then rinsed again. we didn't have water. The city had the water turned off, as you know, and we were dipping water out of the tanks at toilets, draining hot water heaters, just anything. We just didn't have enough water, and the film just overdeveloped and was turned black in a very short time. We did a lot of names. People said there was names they're missing or presumed maybe fatalities. And there are 6,000 to 8,000 names originally. And so we read those names on radio and television. And if you heard your name or your neighbor's name, or you were to call in, and then we would remove it to try and get that to manageable so that they knew who was really missing or who was still walking the streets of Rapid City. And finally, the station did receive a presidential from Richard Nixon commendation for our work during this tragic time, and which made your efforts know it was appreciated by the people of America.
Jack.
There you go.
The broadcast media, who I have in the years since the flood credited with saving a lot of lives. The Rapid City Journal, which didn't print the next day, didn't save any lives. It only told the public what had happened. Communication was very difficult. Actually, 4 of us reporters and editors from the Rapid City Journal might have had the first look at the flood, because one of them had heard reports of high water in the High Sega area about 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. And 4 of us, the 29 Club, we were all the same age, all 29 years old, headed west on Highway 44 to check out high water in the High Sega area. 2 of them made it across a stream of water that was cascading across Highway 44, 4 or 5 miles west of town, roughly in the area where you pass the sign that says entering the Black Hills National Forest. A whole river, a raging river, was crossing the road. 2 of them got in the pickup truck and crossed it. The other 2, my friend Ron Bender and myself, chickened out, and we turned around and went back. Got back to my house about 45 minutes later. I lived on 3rd Avenue, and we had to, a policeman and a fireman came to the door, and we had to evacuate my house, and that's sort of another story. If we're talking about media coverage, let's see if we can stay in that area. The electronic media did indeed come back on the air when electric power was restored. The Rapid City Journal scrapped its Saturday edition for a couple of reasons. One is that there was too much news to handle. The second reason being the loss of both gas and electricity for parts of the night had cooled off all the lead in the linotype machines, and it took quite a while to get the printing machinery back into operation. And so we just threw the Saturday paper out and concentrated on a Sunday edition. And the Saturday morning reporting crew became the Sunday reporting crew. And when I was supposed to, my shift called me to work the Saturday afternoon 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift. Well, I knew I had a big story on my hands, so I went in early. The whole Saturday morning shift was there, had been there all morning, and were reporting the story. Communication was exceedingly difficult. I didn't think to tell this anecdote to the last group that was in here, but I think it is very appropriate. About noon on Saturday, my wife and I decided we needed to call our parents. Her mother lived in Sioux Falls, my parents lived in Wyoming, and this was already an international news story, and we knew that they were probably frantic. And so I picked up the telephone in my friend's house, and it was deader than a doornail. I continued to hold the telephone receiver for 45 minutes until I got a dial tone. We got my wife's mother on the phone. My wife held the phone, and I didn't realize that she was rather overcome with emotion. And she said, "Mother, and then she handed me the phone." So I told my mother-in-law what had happened and assured her that we were all safe, and then asked her to call my parents, and that was it. But the fact that there was 45 minutes of dead air on the telephone sort of illustrates how difficult the news gathering operation became. So we went out on the street. We talked to people. People came into the Journal, officials, police, fire, city officials, county officials, and every reporter on the Journal staff became a flood reporter. It didn't matter what their assigned beats were, they were flood reporters. We put out a pretty comprehensive Sunday edition. And for the next, well, I worked for the Journal for another 12 years beyond that. We never missed another edition other than that Saturday paper, the Saturday after the flood. And where was I going with that? Oh, in mid-September, the city editor, Jack Weaver, had a smile on his face one day, and he said, "This is the first day in the last 3.5 months that we have not had a flood or flood-related story on page 1 of the Rapid City Journal." There were flood stories in other parts of the paper, but that was the first day that there were no flood stories on page 1. And at certain times, there were nothing but flood stories on page 1. And yet we were still a small city daily newspaper whose obligation it was to report not only local events, not only South Dakota events, but national and international news. And so we continued to attempt to do that. And I continued to attempt to run. I was the police reporter at the time. I had a set of procedures that I followed every day, which included visiting the police station, the sheriff's office, the highway patrol office, and municipal court and circuit court, and tried to carry that on. Of course, much of what I was reporting was flood related, but I happened to look into one of my old reporter's notebooks. I've kept practically all of them that I've ever filled for about 3 days after the flood, and there was 3 pages of names and ages and addresses of people who had violated a traffic law and paid a fine in municipal court. And I had them all faithfully copied down because we were going to run a column of agate type telling what had occurred in municipal court. And this was just a couple of days after the flood. We continued to put out a newspaper. So it was tough, but we did it.
Those were the DUIs.
Yeah, right. Some of my police stories, stories from the police beat, took a slightly different bent in the days after the flood. I had never run a story that listed the names of curfew violators, because I think it was a 9 or 9:30 p.m. curfew was put in effect right immediately after the flood. You weren't supposed to be out poking around at night, I guess. Looting, and there was looting. That became probably when I wrote the police blotter and all the things that had come to the attention of the Rapid City Police, in addition to accidents, was looting stories. Many, not only householders who had left their homes temporarily, but a lot of businesses whose front doors and windows might have been opened to whoever happened to be walking by, lost personal property and merchandise to looters. I had never before had to write a story from the police beat about what they were doing about packs of dogs running around, who seemed to be ownerless and were certainly not confined. And at one point, an order went out to the law enforcement agencies to shoot packs of dogs. So I don't know how many dogs they actually killed, but I guess that's beside the point. So we covered the flood, and we also continued to try to cover the rest of the Rapid City community and surrounding areas. We were all flood reporters, and we were all still general assignment reporters. Beat reporters, I guess I should say.
You want to stay with the press? Or you want-
Ned.
Oh, okay. My experience is a little different. I was a month short of turning 22, and I had a summer internship at Rapid Cable. I think it was Channel 11 or something. And once a day, this was back at the beginning of cable TV, and there was a little camera on a pivot, and it scanned a thermometer and a clock and a barometer, and then it would reverse direction, and this would go on most of the day. There'd be a little card put up that would be an advertisement for Fisher Furniture or something. But every night, that camera would go off, and a camera would come on in the studio, and Dick Scholvach and I would read news and give weather and do sports. And that was my introduction to TV. But the night of June 9th, we had spent watching this incredible formation of clouds build up and build up and build up, and they turned black, and then they turned this sort of bruised purple, and then they turned the color of a bruise about 3 days after you've gotten it. It gets that sort of sick green look, and it was just, it was extraordinary to see. Well, this is wonderful visuals for TV. So my producer director and I set out from the studio to get to Skyline Drive to do, I think we had in mind like a 360 to show this incredible sky. No idea what was about to happen. We got about a quarter mile down East Boulevard, and the rain started, and started. It just was sheets of rain. Within minutes, we couldn't see off the hood of my producer director's Jeep, and it didn't let up. And it didn't let up for hours. We made a decision that I should not try to get home west of the Gap, that I should crash on his apartment floor east of the Gap. And we got to his place, and then the power went out. And then woke up the next morning and really oblivious of what had happened during the night, like most of Rapid City, frankly. I think, people on the east side, in the south and the north, even in my family living on Brookside Drive on the South Canyon side, no idea of the death and destruction that was happening on the other side of the hill. But he turned on his little transistor radio, battery operated, and we heard our boss, Dick Scholvach, broadcasting from Kim out in Rapid Valley, and made the decision we had to get to the boss to get an assignment. And when I arrived, Gene Taylor, the owner of the station, said, Gary Peterson, the engineer, has gone ahead to the Pennington County Courthouse. That's where disaster response headquarters is. You've got a little temporary recording facility. You go there and read official announcements till this is done. And I spent 11 days in the basement of the Pennington County Courthouse, initially reading announcements about don't drink the water, boil it, get your shots. And then we'd started making announcements. Has anybody seen so-and-so? If so call this number. Do you need food? Go here. If you need clothing, go there. And then eventually, after just about 3 days, they handed us the list of the officially confirmed dead. And it was a cold read. There was no time to survey it and see who's on there. Really not much time to think about how to read it, because every name on the list meant something to somebody, and yet you can't read it ponderously because, people knew it was a long list and they're waiting to find out what happened to their friend or their neighbor or. So I started in reading this cold and wasn't sure at what speed to read it, what should be my tone of voice. Got about 6 names in, thought I recognized a name, stopped, choked, and then it occurred to me that's the space of time that everybody is going through as they hear a name. Just give them a moment to absorb it and then move on. And that, so Kim wasn't on that night. We were different from KOTA. We were a sun-up to sundown station typically till we got under the emergency broadcast system the permission to go longer. And I didn't, I sat in the basement. I didn't see much of what was going on, but the horror was coming in to the disaster response headquarters as these names that started as thousands of names and women upstairs with lists alphabetized. National College of Business had a mainframe computer. They offered to take these names that were coming in from all over the place and alphabetize them. And that was a big, big deal. So now when people called in and said, no, this is, I'll use one of my brothers, this is Ben Leonard, I'm okay. Then the women could turn around and cross his name off the list. He's okay. So we took a list of several thousand names, reading them on the air, and got it down after a couple of readings down to about 1,000. And then, that was just sort of the mechanical thing that radio was reduced to in a way, but it was just extraordinarily important because it was all about information. And so the combination of what you heard and saw on KOTA, what you heard on Kim, what you could read in the journal once they were able to publish, that's what began to put the city back together again.
All the way down, Dave.
I'm David Super. I represent the weekly newspaper industry that once existed in Rapid City. I came here the week before the flood to complete my National Guard duty obligations, and then started my job at the paper after that 2-week period was finished. Things I'd like to add for those of you particularly who have stayed here, some points that I think need to be emphasized, particularly from a print journalism standpoint, because that's where my career started, is that we adults, and I was only 25 then, that was our life, our dedication. We tried to put as much energy as we could into producing stories and photographs of the flood, as did the broadcast journalists as well. And then in the newspaper industry in 1972, we turned that product over to children who delivered the paper to your house. And unique in the industry, in the world of purveying information over where all these serious adults and advertisers with their money and subscription money and all of that, and you get a 11-year-old kid to deliver the product. You don't do that today, and times have changed. And we didn't have any of our youth carriers at the Rapid City Guide be casualties of the flood. It scrambled up our delivery mechanism for quite some time because whole neighborhoods were gone, and so we had to reconfigure all of that. But to pass the news to the household by household by household by household, children were doing that final. They were the last mile for us, and when I think about that today, I think, geez, kids were doing this. I was a paper carrier, and I survived somehow or another. So that was an important thing. Next slide. This is what the Rapid City Guide did the week after the flood. We were, unlike the journal, we published on Thursday as normal, and then the following Thursday we published again. The printing plant that we used was in Sturgis. And so even though the Rapid City Guide was a 100% casualty of the flood, the entire building went down the creek, we soldiered on by being able to use our publisher's headquarters operation that was in Sturgis. And that continued for the rest of the summer as we kind of dug ourselves out of that hole that we were in. And we had to move the operation up onto Quincy Street. Next slide, please. All of the media that was, the local media that was in Rapid City, and in the region for that matter, we were all competing professionally for the same stories. I think there certainly was a spirit of, hey, we've got to get this information out regardless because it's important, and the whole area has undergone this incredible disaster. But we were also still competitors with each other. We were competitors for news stories, and we were competitors for advertising dollars. And that whole engine had to keep running, or we were done. We without advertising dollars, subscription revenue, other sources of income, that was it. There wouldn't have been any media covering the flood from a local standpoint. And so I think historically that's important to remember, is that we were businesses and we competed against each other at all levels. And that makes products get better. It also wears you out after a while. So that was another thing that and certainly in the news business, we had to we competed for stories. There were the overarching stories of where to go for relief and what's going to happen next and who died and all of those kinds of things that were going on. But then there were all the human interest stories and other things that still had to be reported. The sports department shifted back into gear, and you started covering, Little League didn't stop that summer, I don't think, and other things like life went on in the community and in the region. And so that became part of the media coverage umbrella that all of you as readers and listeners would have been participating in. The other thing I want to just emphasize is the importance and the visibility that national and international media outlets brought to the Black Hills and to the emergency. We had the flood in 1972, in the spring of 1972. George McGovern runs for president. That takes several months to work its way through the news cycle. And then the American Indian movement, all of a sudden, for a completely different reason, raised the visibility of South Dakota, the Black Hills, and that was an intense, complex, emotional story that continued on through the winter and summer of 1973. There was a lot going on in the Black Hills during that 18-month period, and lots of millions of words written, hundreds of thousands of photographs taken, and I don't know how many miles of still motion picture film and videotape captured, and South Dakota was very visible during that time period. There was a big flood in Colorado later that year, another flood in Pennsylvania that year. There were other competing disasters going on, and I think lessons learned by we journalists and the community and the first responders were all important as well, and ways and techniques and more foolproof methods for delivering information to the general public. And that was a role that, as a 25-year-old, I didn't understand. I was too young, too green to really grasp it. Now, looking back, and when we watch on television or read about disasters that happen around the nation or around the world for that matter, and we're all so accustomed to instant coverage and replay and all of those things that didn't exist in 1972, it certainly reminds me of the incredible obligation that elected officials and government officials and other people in authority have to tell an accurate, timely, comprehensive story. And that always doesn't happen. And that is very difficult to do. And we don't always get it right. So
I just want you to know that at 4 o'clock, there will be a storyboard dedication at the Summit Arena. You can leave any time if you want, but we're going to continue on a little bit longer, and we'll start at the top here. And some of the obstacles of the day, lessons learned, if you each have a chance to tell us just a little bit more about your thoughts about covering the tragedy.
Well, we made a little point about the technology that was not available. No cell phones, no internet, no computers, no print, go to the printer. It was a slow, cumbersome analog process. But I've debated whether I really want to say this, but I think I'm going to. The local media has an objective. Of course, there are stories that we want to cover, stories we want to tell, and information that has to get to the public. But Rapid City was swarmed by the networks. The Rapid City Journal their offices were filled by people from around the world who were reporting the story. And it was my exposure as a local guy to how the national people covered a disaster that really formed professional decisions I made. Because, and I'll just tell this story, it's not the most horrendous, but when the rumors went about Pactola Dam having broken, their panic just broke out all over town. And I was directed to get in a police car or a sheriff's car, I don't remember, and go to Camp Rapid and get on a helicopter and fly with Congressman Aberesk upstream to look at the dams, and then come back and on the ground get back on live on the air and say, I'm local, I've seen it, everything's okay, assuming it was, and we believed it to be so. But when I arrived and the Huey helicopter's blades are, in that mode of getting ready to go, and the congressman is standing there, a network field crew, a producer and a cameraman, tried to make a case to the congressman that I was a local kid, that they should get my seat on the helicopter because they were national and they had, their story would go all over the country. And Congressman Aberesk, to his credit, said, you're looking for disaster. This kid's helping people to keep from panicking. Get on the helicopter, Ned. And I mean, that's, and that was the way it was in 1972, before CNN, before the 24-hour news cycle, which is breaking news, disaster here, disaster there, shooting, this, that. And I saw how that stuff got covered, and I wasn't interested.
I don't know that I really have anything to add. I would be willing to answer your questions if you have any. And if you have, yes.
I just got a piece of information. I was sitting at up on top of the cross near the Holiday Inn when the wall of water hit. Power and Light had a substation by the creek west of the West Boulevard Bridge. And when the wall of water hit that substation, it was like somebody with a giant arc welder over there welding. It was just a huge white fireball, and then everything went black. And of course, that's when KOGA lost their power. But
You know what time that was?
say what?
You know what time that was? When that wall of water hit the station?
I was up on the top of the cross street. Oh, it was about, well, it would have been when about 11:30, somewhere in there. It was about when most of Rapid City lost power, because that's when we've been listening to KOGA. That's when KOGA went off the air, and I saw that big, huge.
It was about 10:45. I was about 2 blocks from that.
Well, some time in there, but yeah, it was, and it was just amazing what it looked like.
Among my personal memories of the flood and the immediate aftermath, too, are the fog that hung over the entire city the next morning. The roar of the creek was like standing right beside Niagara Falls for hours and hours and hours throughout the city. And then in the next several days, as things sort of dried up, the choking dust layer that killed most of us off. Well, I guess most of us are still here, aren't we? Other questions or observations?
A question I'm going to ask because you folks are all broadcast. Well, Jack, you and I are print guys. A question that I would have is that
as a participant or as an employee of the town's weekly newspaper, and we scratched and struggled, and I don't think we made a nickel a year for the 10 years that I worked at the paper. But anyway, kind of set the stage of who was delivering news. KOTA, was KDSJ broadcasting them, the Channel 7?
Or KRSD.
Or KRSD, they were on? They were off?
Yeah.
Okay.
They had no power up there. They
But did they come back online?
well,
All right.
they were down. Well, KRSD TV was on Jackson Boulevard. Bonnie used to work there.
1438 Mountain View.
Oh, Mountain View. It's right about, and I think they probably got flooded out because I don't remember where they got
Well,
back.
no, it was up on a hill where the studio was. And, of course, their transmitter was up on Skyline Drive. And,
When did they get back on?
well, I can't tell you that. I really can't.
Nobody watched it.
That's true.
Realistically.
I really don't recall, but that's they wouldn't have been flooded out.
But I'll use my outside voice. The radio stations, there was KOTA,
Right. Kim.
KIMM,
KTOQ.
KTOQ.
Well, it's
That which
KRSD.
what came from KRSD.
Okay, KRSD, and that was it, right?
No, there was a fourth one.
KKLS.
And KKLS. All AM,
Yes.
no FM radio then.
I don't think there was an AFM.
KKLS was 980, yeah.
So it was all AM radio, a daily newspaper, a weekly newspaper, children delivering our product. Cable TV was an infant at that time with, I don't know what the audience would have been or the paid subscribers would have been, but it was a very small thing. And when you think about where we are today and how we choke with information, and regrettably, too many questions that are planted in minds regarding the accuracy, the authenticity of the voice that you're listening to, and how do you sort out the hard work that had to be done from the basement of the courthouse to read the death notice, read these critically important messages that had to go out to the public, and how kind of cleanly that was delivered. And I don't know if today, with where we are in the media environment, we could still appreciate that same kind of accurate, timely, unadulterated information that might save your life or save your pocketbook or reassure you that yes, there's been this huge fire, there's been this volcano, flood, whatever, but this is the trustworthy voice that you should hold on to. And that's a lesson that we're still learning.
Yeah. That's why you need to have local media.
Yeah.
Any
Yes,
of
sir.
your closing thoughts? Or close?
I had some brilliant thought, but I forgot it. Do you have it? I'll pass it.
Any other question? Oh, you have a thought?
Just a quick one. I'll use my outside voice.
Okay.
No mics here, I guess.
They might be recording.
Yeah, okay. The thought I've got has to do with Bill and Monty just dropped the name Vern Shepherd. The credibility of Vern Shepherd and Jim Neal and Dick Schovach and others. I mean, that, and when you read the Journal, the credibility of Jim Keene as the managing editor and Jack Cannon. I mean, these that they were reporting the local news was beyond just integrity, it was comfort. I mean, Vern Shepherd's voice reading that death list. I mean, if it was a competition, I lost. Because Vern, that was comfort.
I might just, as a matter of information, point out to you newspaper readers that in 1972, a copy of the Rapid City Journal weekday edition cost 10 cents.
Show them what they got. Show them what they got for 10 cents.
But once again, ours is free.
Any other questions? Anything we can answer for you? Covering the tragedy. I mean, I was almost 10. I was watching television that night, and I saw across the bottom of the screen all night long that the creek was rising. Get away from the creek. I saw that all night long. And unless you were watching television, maybe you weren't aware of that. But I was keenly aware, and I was just a kid.
Well, KOTA was advertising for a while. Box Elder Creek flooded, and I don't know who noticed it, but they were advertising for a while of the problems on Box Elder Creek, and they were asking for boat owners with 40 horsepower motors or greater, and really were unaware at that point what was precipitating.
Well, the mayor had called.
Yeah.
The mayor had called and said there's a heart attack, cardiac arrest up at the dog track, and they couldn't get across the Box Elder Creek, and so he called and asked for if we'd send advertise for a boat to go up there, volunteer. So, no, that's true.
Question?
Yeah, I was wondering what station that the mayor made his announcement to evacuate.
But that was on our KOTA.
God bless you, because that saved our whole cul-de-sac.
Well, I know there was a fellow in the previous one that was here, and he said his dad was listening to KOTA, and they lived in Deadwood. And he said he was thinking about trying to drive up Boulder Canyon that night, and he stayed at the parking lot at the old Rapid High up there on Columbus Street. And he said, and he was overseas in the military when that happened, and he said, my dad's alive. And my dad admitted it, because he would have been in Boulder Canyon, and you don't want to meet that stuff coming down.
Any final questions? Anything on your mind from the people who were there and covering the flood of 1972? If not, we thank you very much. You're welcome to come up and talk to the individuals. There's a map where the flood was. We have that newspaper that was the Sunday edition. Is that correct? Yeah. A special edition of the flood. But thank you very much. Covering the tragedy 1972.